Today I'm going to talk about the spotlight effect. I will discuss what it is and how it relates to social judgment in today's society. To do this, I will be using the research done by Gilovich, Medvec, and Savitsky from 2000, and it is titled The Spotlight Effect in Social Judgment. So their basic research question was, how does the participants' estimates of how prominent their actions and appearances compare to how they actually appear? So basically, how does what someone feels like happened compare to what actually happened? For this study, after the research they had looked into before the experiment, the hypothesis these scientists came up with was that they predicted that people would be so consumed with their own knowledge of the shirt that they had to wear and the embarrassment it engendered that they would be unable to accurately assess how noticeable it was to others. So, in other words, the researchers predicted that they would overestimate the number of people who actually did notice the shirt. So, the research method they used was pretty simple. They had 109 Cornell University undergraduates volunteer to participate in the study in exchange for extra credit in a psychology class. 15 served as target participants, and of the 15, 8 were women and 7 were men. They also had 64 volunteers as observers, and the other 30 participants served as control groups in one of the 2 conditions. This experiment ran 2 control conditions. Participants in both of these conditions were shown a videotaped reenactment of the procedure and asked questions about what they thought would be the result. These questions will be discussed later in the presentation. Alright. The observers were scheduled for a time 5 minutes before each participant was due to arrive. They scheduled 6 observers for each session. They ran this experiment several times with different amounts of observers each time. They had 1 session with 6 observers, 5 sessions with 5 observers, 7 sessions with 4 observers, and 1 session each with 3 and 2 observers. Once the observers arrived, they were let into a laboratory room and were asked to take a seat at a long table in the center of the room. They placed chairs only on one side of the table, so all the participants took a seat facing the doorway. The experimenter explained that they would begin by simply filling out a questionnaire, which the participants worked on without realizing the experiment was going on. 5 minutes after the observers arrived, the target participants arrived. A second experimenter informed the target that the experiment would be taken in a room, but before they could go into that room, that he had to put on a t-shirt with the picture of Barry Manilow on the front. They then asked the participant what they thought about the shirt, and they were all pretty embarrassed that they had to put on a shirt with this particular man on the front. The experimenter then led him to the door of the laboratory where the observers were taking the questionnaire. The target was invited into the room by the experimenter who was watching the observers take the questionnaire, and he encouraged the target to sit in a chair that was facing all of the observers. But just as the target was about to sit down, the experimenter said, "On second thought," and told the target that the others were too far ahead on the questionnaire, that perhaps it would be best if he waited outside for a minute. The target gladly stepped outside, and the other experimenter explained to him that the focus of the investigation was incidental memory, which is people's awareness of things that they are not told to pay attention to. Then the experimenter asked the target this question: "How many of the people in the room you were in would be able to tell me who was on the front of your shirt?" And as the target answered this question, the experimenter in the room with the observers asked them, "How many of you can tell me who was on the shirt of the person who walked into the room?" The results were very interesting. This figure shows the predicted and actual percentage of observers able to identify Barry Manilow, who was the person on the target's t-shirt. The control group 1 was asked the same question as the target was. So, how many of the people in the room they were in could identify who was on the front of their shirt? The second control group was asked the same question as the observers, which was how many of them could actually tell them who was on the front of the shirt. In this figure, because the number of observers were different depending on the session, the experimenters converted the results to percentages. The first two bars show the comparison of the target's estimations and the actual accuracy of the observers. As is shown, the target participants overestimated the number of people who would be able to say who was on the target's t-shirt. To find the reliability of the findings, they took each target's estimated percentage and subtracted it from the percentage of observers in that session who correctly identified the man on the shirt. The average discrepancy was 23%, and it landed in the interval of which they expected. The interval ranged from 9% to 38%. Then once they took out the one session that had 2 observers and the one session that had 3 observers, the average discrepancy was 27%, with the interval that ranged from 11% to 43%. Overall, I think this is a very well put together experiment. It was conducted well, and the research was very much proved the spotlight effect, what it was, and how it affects social judgment. My questions about the experiment were, does this qualify as a random sample? Because it was volunteers from a psychology class. That's like a specific group, so I'm not sure, but it may. And did any of the students know each other? Because if students did know each other, they may have taken a longer look at the person who walked in the room, and also they may have even taken a longer look at the clothes the target was wearing. I would recommend taking a completely random sample of students, not necessarily just from the same class, and seeing if the results change any. Also, maybe changing who was on the front of the shirt that the target was wearing may show like a bigger difference, maybe make a different impact. But overall, this study does a good job at showing what the spotlight effect is and how it contributes to social judgment.